The small, weathered house sat at the edge of the countryside, surrounded by overgrown grass and a broken fence that had long since surrendered to time. Inside, 10-year-old Clara folded a threadbare blanket over her cot. She had learned to live with less since her parents had died in a car crash 2 years ago. The pain of losing them hadn't lessened, but Clara had grown used to it, like a heavy coat she couldn't take off. Her only companion was Tobias, a graying Labrador who followed her everywhere. That morning, as the sun peeked through the dusty windows, Clara prepared her breakfast. A single slice of bread and a bit of butter scraped from a nearly empty container. She gave Tobias half, scratching his ears as he wagged his tail in gratitude. The world outside her small home seemed vast and indifferent. Her neighbors, scattered across the rural landscape, rarely visited. Clara didn't mind. She'd learned to rely on herself, though sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, she missed the warmth of her mother's embrace or her father's hearty laugh. It was on one such quiet morning that Clara first noticed the moving truck rumbling down the dirt road. She stood at the window, peering through the smudged glass as it pulled up to the abandoned mansion next door. The mansion had once been the pride of the town, a grand, sprawling estate, but it had fallen into disrepair after years of neglect. Clara watched as workers began unloading furniture, followed by a tall woman in her 60s who stepped out of a sleek, black car. The woman had a commanding presence, her posture straight and her silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She wore a long coat and dark glasses, her every movement deliberate. Clara couldn't take her eyes off her. "She's like a queen," Clara murmured to Tobias, who tilted his head. For the rest of the day, Clara watched from her yard as the workers bustled about. She noticed how the woman seemed to direct everything with precision, pointing here and there as furniture and boxes were carried into the house. At one point, the woman paused, turning her head toward Clara's house. Clara froze, feeling the weight of her gaze even from a distance. But the woman didn't approach. Instead, she went inside, leaving Clara with a strange mixture of curiosity and unease. Days passed, and Clara continued to observe her new neighbor from afar. The woman rarely left the mansion, and when she did, it was always in the same sleek car, disappearing down the road without a word to anyone. The mansion itself began to transform, its once crumbling facade repaired, the gardens cleared of weeds. One chilly evening, Clara heard a knock at her door. Startled, she hesitated before opening it to find the woman standing there, holding a basket. Up close, she looked even more regal, her sharp features softened by a tentative smile. "Hello," the woman said, her voice low and warm. "I'm Eleanor. I moved in next door. I thought I'd bring you something." Clara stared at the basket, which was filled with fresh bread, cheese, and fruit, things she hadn't tasted in months. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, taking the basket. Eleanor looked past her into the small, dimly lit home. "Are you here alone?" Clara hesitated. "I have Tobias," she said, gesturing to the dog, who wagged his tail as if on cue. Eleanor chuckled. "A good companion." Her eyes lingered on Clara, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. "Well, if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Clara nodded, unsure of what to say. She watched as Eleanor turned and walked back to the mansion, her coat billowing in the wind. That night, Clara shared the food with Tobias, savoring each bite. She didn't understand why Eleanor had been so kind, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a small spark of hope. In the days that followed, Eleanor's presence became more pronounced. She would wave to Clara from across the yard or leave small gifts on her doorstep, a warm blanket, a tin of cookies. At first, Clara was wary, unsure of Eleanor's intentions. But gradually, she began to feel a sense of safety she hadn't known since her parents were alive. One evening, Eleanor invited Clara to her home for tea. Clara hesitated, unsure of how to act in such an elegant setting. But Tobias nudged her with his nose, as if urging her to go. Inside the mansion, Clara was awestruck. The once decaying estate had been transformed into a place of beauty, its grand staircase polished, its rooms filled with light and warmth. Eleanor led her to a cozy sitting room where a fire crackled in the hearth. Over tea and biscuits, Eleanor asked gentle questions about Clara's life. Clara found herself opening up, sharing stories about her parents and the accident that had left her alone. Eleanor listened intently, her eyes soft with understanding. "I lost someone too," Eleanor said after a pause. "My son. Many years ago." Her voice faltered for a moment. "It's not something you ever truly get over." Clara nodded, feeling an unexpected connection to the woman. As the evening wore on, Clara felt a warmth she hadn't felt in years. Eleanor walked her back to her house, the two of them laughing softly as Tobias trotted beside them. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt like she wasn't alone. In the weeks that followed, Clara's visits to Eleanor's mansion became more frequent. What had begun as an occasional invitation for tea soon turned into shared dinners, afternoons spent in Eleanor's sunlit garden, and evenings by the fireplace. Eleanor had an air of quiet elegance about her, but when she smiled, Clara could see traces of warmth and kindness that reminded her of her own mother. Eleanor, for her part, found herself drawn to Clara in a way she hadn't anticipated. There was something familiar in the girl's eyes, a spark of resilience and curiosity that tugged at Eleanor's heart. She found herself fussing over Clara, ensuring she had enough to eat and sending her home with leftovers and small gifts. One crisp autumn morning, as Clara helped Eleanor rake leaves in the garden, she asked a question that had been on her mind for some time. "Why did you move here?" Eleanor paused, leaning on the handle of the rake. She seemed to consider her answer carefully. "I wanted a fresh start," she said finally. "Sometimes life takes you places you never expected, and you have to find your way back to something that feels like home." Clara nodded, though she didn't fully understand. She thought about her own small house, which had once been full of laughter and love. She wondered if she would ever feel at home again. That evening, as Clara walked back to her house with Tobias trotting beside her, she found herself thinking about Eleanor's words. She didn't know much about the older woman's past, but she sensed there was pain there, buried beneath the surface. It was a few days later when Clara stumbled across something that would change everything. She had been tidying up her parents' old bedroom, a space she rarely entered, when she found a small wooden chest tucked away in the corner of the closet. Inside were a few photographs, letters, and an old leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to her mother. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. Her mother's neat handwriting filled each page, recounting memories and thoughts from years past. As she read, Clara's heart ached with both love and longing. Her mother had written about her hopes for Clara's future, her love for her husband, and her joy in their simple life. But as Clara neared the end of the journal, the tone shifted. Her mother began to write about someone named Eleanor. At first, the mentions were brief, just a name, a passing reference to a woman her mother had met years ago. But the entries grew more detailed, describing a deep sense of unease. Her mother wrote about a feeling that Eleanor was somehow connected to her own past, though she didn't explain how. One entry caught Clara's attention. "She came to visit me today. She didn't say it outright, but I could feel it in the way she looked at me. There's something she's not telling me, something she wants me to know. I can't shake the feeling that she's a part of my life in ways I don't understand." Clara's heart raced as she read the words. She couldn't understand why her mother had written about Eleanor, or how Eleanor could have known her mother at all. After all, Eleanor had only moved into the mansion recently. The next time Clara visited Eleanor, she brought the journal with her. Sitting in the cozy warmth of the sitting room, she hesitated before pulling it out of her bag. "I found this," she said softly, holding it out to Eleanor. "It was my mom's." Eleanor took the journal with trembling hands. Her expression shifted as she opened it, her eyes scanning the pages. When she reached the passages about herself, she froze. For a long moment, she didn't speak. "Clara," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I knew your mother." Clara's eyes widened. "You did? How?" Eleanor set the journal down carefully on the table. She looked at Clara with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. And so, Eleanor began to share a story she had kept buried for decades. She spoke of a daughter she had lost long ago, a child she had believed was taken from her forever. Eleanor had been a young mother, married to a man whose family was wealthy and powerful. But when her husband's family discovered she was pregnant, they had forced her to give the child away, insisting it was for the best. I never stopped looking for her, Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. But every time I got close, it was like she vanished again. I didn't know where to look anymore. Clara listened, her mind racing. Are you saying my mom was your daughter? Eleanor nodded. I think so, Clara. The timing, the name, it all makes sense. But I didn't realize it until I met you. There's something about you that reminded me of her, and now, she gestured to the journal, now I know I was right. Clara sat back in her chair, overwhelmed. The idea that Eleanor could be her grandmother was almost too much to process. But as she looked at the older woman, she felt a strange sense of comfort. For the first time, the pieces of her fractured life seemed to fit together. Why didn't she tell me? Clara asked. I think she wanted to protect you, Eleanor said. And maybe she wasn't ready to face it herself. Clara nodded slowly. She could understand that. Her mother had always been quiet about her past, never sharing much about her own parents or where she had come from. In the days that followed, Clara and Eleanor began to piece together more of the story. They spent hours talking, sharing memories, and sifting through the contents of the journal and old letters. With each discovery, their bond grew stronger. Eleanor vowed to protect Clara, to ensure she would never feel alone again. Clara, for her part, began to see Eleanor not just as a neighbor or a friend, but as family. The quiet, isolated world Clara had known was beginning to change. Together, she and Eleanor were uncovering the truth and finding healing in the process. Clara woke up the next morning feeling different. The weight she'd carried since her parents' death hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, as if someone else had picked up part of the burden. Knowing Eleanor might truly be her grandmother filled her with a strange mix of hope and uncertainty. She spent the day organizing her thoughts, taking Tobias for a walk along the edge of the fields that bordered her home. The sunlight warmed her face, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to have a family again. Later that afternoon, Eleanor arrived at Clara's house. This time, she didn't bring a basket or gifts. She brought papers and photographs, evidence of a life Clara had never known. Sitting together at the small kitchen table, Eleanor spread out the documents carefully, as if each one carried the weight of the years she had spent searching. This is your mother, Eleanor said, pointing to a black and white photograph of a young woman holding a baby. Clara leaned closer, studying the familiar face. It was her mother, younger, and with a different kind of light in her eyes. Eleanor's voice was steady, but thick with emotion. When I was forced to give her up, I fought as hard as I could to keep her. But the Bradford family had too much power, and I was just a young woman with no say in my own life. She paused, taking a breath. I was told she'd been adopted by a kind family, but I was never given details. Every time I tried to find her, I hit a wall. Clara looked at Eleanor, her heart aching for the pain the older woman had endured. Did you ever stop looking? Never, Eleanor said firmly, even when it seemed hopeless. And now, here you are. She reached across the table, taking Clara's hand in hers. You're proof that I didn't fail completely. You're proof she lived and she loved. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she didn't pull her hand away. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of a connection she hadn't known she craved. As the days turned into weeks, Eleanor and Clara grew closer. Eleanor began to spend more time at Clara's house, helping with repairs that had long been neglected and cooking meals that filled the air with warmth and comfort. Clara, in turn, brought life to Eleanor's mansion, filling its halls with laughter and curiosity as she explored its many rooms and corners. But amid their growing bond, questions lingered. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her parents' accident than what she'd been told. She'd overheard whispers in town after their deaths, hints that it hadn't been a simple crash, that something darker might have been at play. One evening, as they sat by the fire in Eleanor's sitting room, Clara finally voiced her thoughts. Do you think my parents' accident was really just an accident? Eleanor's face grew serious. She had been wondering the same thing, but hadn't wanted to alarm Clara. I don't know, she admitted. but I think it's worth looking into. The next day, Eleanor made a call to a private investigator she had once hired during her search for her daughter. A few days later, the investigator arrived in town, a middle-aged man named Robert with a quiet demeanor and sharp eyes. He listened carefully as Eleanor and Clara shared what they knew. "Car accidents can be tricky," Robert said. "Sometimes the truth is buried under layers of reports and assumptions. But I'll start digging." While Robert worked, Clara and Eleanor continued their search through the documents and keepsakes Eleanor had saved over the years. One afternoon, Clara came across a stack of old letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were haunting. The letters were addressed to Eleanor, written by someone who seemed to know too much about her life. They hinted at threats, warnings to stop her search for her daughter, and veiled references to powerful figures who wouldn't take kindly to her questions. Eleanor read the letters with a sinking feeling in her chest. "These were sent to me years ago," she explained. "I thought they were just attempts to scare me, to keep me from finding her. But now—" She trailed off, her mind racing. Clara frowned. "Do you think the same people could have been involved in my parents' accident?" Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she folded the letters carefully, as if handling something fragile. "It's possible," she said finally. "But if they were, then we need to find out why." Robert's investigation soon uncovered details that made Clara's heart pound. The accident report had been altered, key information missing or redacted. Witnesses who had been at the scene described strange behavior from a man who had arrived shortly after the crash, claiming to be from an insurance company. The man had asked unusual questions about the car and its occupants, then disappeared before anyone could confirm his identity. "It's not conclusive," Robert said during their next meeting, "but it's suspicious. Someone didn't want the full story to come out." As the pieces began to fit together, Clara and Eleanor realized they were up against forces that had tried to bury the truth for years. Yet, for the first time, they weren't facing it alone. Together, they vowed to uncover what had happened, no matter the cost. The nights grew colder as winter approached, but inside the small house, a sense of warmth and determination filled the air. Clara and Eleanor worked side by side, sifting through every clue, every memory, and every scrap of evidence they could find. For Clara, it was more than a quest for answers. It was a journey toward understanding where she came from and the family she had thought she'd lost forever. For Eleanor, it was a chance to reclaim the part of her life that had been stolen from her and to protect the granddaughter she had only just found. The road ahead was uncertain, but as they sat together by the fire that evening, they knew one thing for sure. They would face it together. The wind howled outside as Clara sat on the worn couch in her living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Eleanor was across from her, a cup of tea in her hands, her expression thoughtful but resolute. Tobias lay at Clara's feet, his head resting on his paws, as though sensing the tension in the room. "We're close to something," Eleanor said quietly, breaking the silence. Clara nodded. The information Robert had uncovered, combined with the mysterious letters Eleanor had received years ago, painted a picture of something much darker than either of them had imagined. But the exact details remained elusive, shrouded in secrecy. "I just don't understand why anyone would want to hurt them," Clara said, her voice trembling. "My parents weren't. They weren't important to anyone but me." Eleanor set her cup down and leaned forward, her eyes steady. "Sometimes, people become targets not because of who they are, but because of who they're connected to." Clara stared at her, the meaning behind her words sinking in. "You think this has to do with you?" Eleanor hesitated before answering. "It's possible. The Bradford family, the people who forced me to give up your mother, they had a way of controlling everything around them. If they thought I was getting too close, they wouldn't hesitate to." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. A shiver ran down Clara's spine. She had always believed the accident was a tragic twist of fate. Now, the idea that it might have been intentional filled her with equal parts anger and fear. Robert arrived later that evening, bringing with him a thick folder of documents and a cautious optimism. He spread the papers out on the table, pointing to a photograph of a man with sharp features and a cold smile. "This is Gerald Bradford," Robert explained. the head of the family back when Eleanor was forced to give up her daughter. He passed away years ago, but his influence is still felt. The company he built remains powerful, and some of the people who worked for him are still alive. Clara looked at the photograph, her stomach twisting. Do you think they're involved in what happened to my parents? Robert nodded slowly. I can't say for certain, but there's a connection. Gerald had a nephew, Leonard Bradford, who was known for taking care of unpleasant situations. He was in charge of managing problems for the family. His name came up in a few witness statements from the day of the crash. Eleanor's hand tightened into a fist. Leonard was always Gerald's enforcer. If he was there, it wasn't a coincidence. Clara felt a surge of anger. But why? My parents didn't deserve this. Eleanor reached out, placing a comforting hand on Clara's arm. I know they didn't, but we'll find out why. And we'll make sure whoever is responsible is held accountable. Over the next few days, Clara and Eleanor worked closely with Robert, piecing together the fragments of information he had uncovered. They discovered that Leonard Bradford had been tracking Eleanor's movements for years, keeping tabs on her attempts to locate her daughter. When he learned of Clara's parents, it appeared he had taken steps to eliminate what he saw as a threat to the family's reputation. The realization was a heavy blow for Clara. She struggled to reconcile the loving memories of her parents with the cold, calculated decision to take their lives. But as painful as the truth was, it also gave her a sense of purpose. We can't let them get away with this, she said one evening as she and Eleanor sat together, reviewing their findings. Eleanor nodded. We won't, but we have to be smart about it. The Bradfords are powerful, and they don't play fair. It was Robert who came up with a plan. Using his connections, he arranged a meeting with a journalist known for exposing corruption in powerful families. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Hale, agreed to take on the story after hearing the details. This could be dangerous, Margaret warned them during their first meeting. If the Bradfords catch wind of what we're doing, they'll come after you. Eleanor's gaze was steady. Let them. I've lived in fear of them for too long. It's time they faced the consequences of what they've done. Margaret's investigation moved quickly. She uncovered additional evidence linking Leonard Bradford to the scene of the crash and found records of payments to local officials who had helped cover up the truth. The story was damning, and Margaret promised to publish it as soon as she had all the pieces. As the deadline approached, tensions ran high. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Strange cars lingered near their homes, and phone calls went unanswered or were met with silence. Then, one evening, Leonard Bradford himself appeared at Eleanor's door. He was older now, his once imposing figure slightly hunched, but his eyes still held the same cold determination as the photograph Robert had shown them. I'm here to make you an offer, Leonard said, his voice smooth but threatening. Walk away from this, and I'll make sure you're left alone. Keep pushing, and you'll regret it. Eleanor stood her ground. Her chin lifted defiantly. You've taken too much from me already. I won't back down now. Leonard's smile didn't reach his eyes. You're making a mistake. Eleanor shut the door in his face, her heart pounding. That night, Clara and Eleanor stayed up late, preparing for what they knew would be a battle. But despite the danger, they found strength in each other. You're so much like your mother, Eleanor said, her voice soft. She was brave, just like you. Clara smiled through her tears. And you're stronger than anyone I've ever met. The next morning, Margaret's article was published. It detailed the Bradfords' crimes and the lengths they had gone to in order to protect their secrets. The story spread quickly, sparking outrage and calls for justice. For Clara and Eleanor, it was a victory hard won, but it was only the beginning. Together, they faced the challenges ahead with determination, knowing they had already overcome so much. The days following the article's publication were a whirlwind. Reporters showed up in the small town, eager for interviews with Eleanor and Clara, but they kept their distance, choosing instead to focus on what mattered most: the aftermath of their decision to expose the Bradfords. Margaret's article had struck a nerve. It wasn't just the shocking details of the car accident cover-up or the Bradfords' long history of manipulation that captured the public's attention. It was the human story at its heart. Eleanor's decades-long search for her daughter, the tragic loss of Clara's parents, and the connection between two women brought together by unimaginable loss and resilience touched readers deeply. But for all the public sympathy, there was also an undercurrent of danger. Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and she wasn't wrong. One evening, as she walked home from the store, headlights appeared behind her, moving slowly and staying too close. She quickened her pace, clutching her bag tightly, her heart pounding. The car stopped suddenly, its tires crunching on the gravel road. Clara froze, unsure whether to run or confront whoever was inside. Before she could decide, the driver's window rolled down, and a man leaned out, his face shadowed. "You're stirring up trouble," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Leave the past where it belongs, or you'll regret it." The car sped off before Clara could respond, leaving her shaken and angry. She hurried home, her mind racing. When she told Eleanor what had happened, the older woman's face hardened with determination. "They're trying to scare us," Eleanor said. "It means we're getting to them." But even as she spoke, Clara could see the worry in her eyes. The Bradfords were still powerful, and while their influence might be waning under the weight of the scandal, they weren't finished yet. Robert intensified his efforts to protect them, hiring security to watch over their homes and accompanying them whenever they needed to leave the house. Despite the precautions, tension hung heavy in the air, and Clara found it hard to sleep, her dreams haunted by the image of the car following her, the driver's voice echoing in her mind. One morning, as she sipped her coffee, a thought struck her. "Eleanor," she said, setting down her mug, "we've been so focused on what happened to my parents. But what about before that? What if there's something in my father's past, or even my mother's, that we've missed?" Eleanor nodded slowly, considering Clara's words. "It's possible. Your parents were good people, but everyone has a history. Maybe there's something there that connects to the Bradfords." They decided to search through the old boxes stored in Clara's attic, which held the remnants of her parents' lives. Dusty photo albums, letters, and keepsakes spilled onto the floor as they sifted through the memories. It was bittersweet for Clara, who hadn't gone through these things since her parents' death. Amid the faded photographs and handwritten notes, they found something curious: an envelope addressed to Clara's father, postmarked from a city miles away. Inside was a letter, its ink faded but legible. The writer spoke cryptically about a business deal gone wrong and warned Clara's father to stay quiet, for your family's sake. "What is this?" Clara asked, her brow furrowed as she read the letter aloud. Eleanor's face grew grim. "It sounds like someone was threatening him. This might be connected to the Bradfords." The discovery sent them back to Robert, who took the letter and promised to investigate. Days later, he returned with news that shook them both. Clara's father had once worked for a company that did business with the Bradfords. When he uncovered illegal practices within the company, he tried to report them, only to be silenced with threats. "It looks like he walked away from it," Robert said, "but someone must have seen him as a liability." Especially when Eleanor's search for her daughter brought attention back to the family, Clara felt a rush of anger and sadness. Her father had tried to do the right thing, only to pay the ultimate price. As they processed this new information, the situation with the Bradfords escalated. Leonard Bradford, now publicly disgraced and facing legal investigations, grew increasingly desperate. One evening, he arrived unannounced at Eleanor's house, his face a mask of fury. "You think you've won?" he snarled, stepping into the foyer uninvited. "You've destroyed my family's reputation, dragged my name through the mud. But this isn't over." Eleanor stood her ground, her voice calm but firm. "You brought this on yourself, Leonard. All I've done is bring the truth to light." Leonard took a step closer, his expression menacing. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Before he could say more, Robert appeared in the doorway, flanked by one of the security guards he had hired. "That's enough," Robert said, his voice steady. "Leave now, or I'll call the police." Leonard hesitated, his bravado faltering under their watchful gazes. With a sneer, he turned and left, slamming the door behind him. Despite the confrontation, Clara and Eleanor refused to back down. They continued working with Margaret and Robert, providing evidence for the ongoing investigations into the Bradfords. The community rallied around them, offering support and encouragement as the story unfolded. For Clara, the experience was transformative. She had spent so long feeling isolated, trapped by her grief and the weight of her parents' loss. Now, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, strengthened by her bond with Eleanor and the knowledge that they were fighting for justice, not just for her parents, but for everyone the Bradfords had harmed. Eleanor, too, found herself changed by the ordeal. For years, she had carried the guilt of losing her daughter, believing she had failed to protect her. But through Clara, she saw that her love and determination had made a difference. Together, they were reclaiming what had been taken from them, one step at a time. As winter settled over the town, the first signs of hope began to emerge. Legal action against the Bradfords gained momentum, and Leonard was forced to step down from his remaining business interests. Though the battle was far from over, Clara and Eleanor knew they were closer to the truth, and to the justice they had long sought. Snow blanketed the town, softening the harsh lines of winter and muffling the sounds of the world outside. Clara sat by the window, watching the flakes drift lazily to the ground. Despite the peaceful scene, her mind churned with everything that had happened. She thought of the letter they had found, the threats against her father, and Leonard's angry confrontation. The weight of it all was exhausting, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. Eleanor entered the room, carrying 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. She set one in front of Clara and settled into the chair across from her, her expression pensive but warm. "You've been quiet all morning," Eleanor said gently. Clara smiled faintly, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Just thinking. It's hard to believe how much has changed in such a short time." Eleanor nodded, understanding. "It's been a lot for both of us. But you've handled it with more strength than you realize." Clara appreciated the encouragement, though she didn't feel particularly strong. Still, Eleanor's presence had become a source of comfort she hadn't known she needed. They had been through so much together, and the bond they shared felt unshakable. Later that day, Robert arrived with news that set their plans into motion. He had uncovered additional evidence tying Leonard Bradford to the bribes paid to cover up the crash. Bank records showed payments made to local officials just days after the accident, and witness testimonies confirmed Leonard had been seen near the crash site shortly before it occurred. "We have enough to bring this to court," Robert said, his voice firm. "The authorities are finally taking this seriously." Clara felt a mix of relief and anxiety. It was what they had been working toward, but the idea of facing the Bradfords in a legal battle was daunting. Eleanor, however, seemed resolute. "This is the right thing to do," Eleanor said, placing a reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder. "We're not just fighting for your parents. We're fighting for every person they've hurt." The legal proceedings began in earnest, drawing national attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators, all eager to see the once powerful Bradfords brought to justice. Clara and Eleanor sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly together as the trial unfolded. Leonard Bradford was defiant, his lawyers attempting to discredit the evidence and portray him as a victim of a smear campaign. But the prosecution was relentless, presenting a compelling case that left little room for doubt. Witnesses testified about the Bradfords' history of corruption, and Margaret's article was used to highlight the broader implications of their actions. When it was Clara's turn to testify, she felt a surge of nerves but drew strength from Eleanor's steady presence. She spoke about her parents, their love and sacrifices, and the pain of losing them so suddenly. Her voice trembled at times, but her words carried the weight of truth, resonating with everyone in the room. Eleanor followed, her testimony equally powerful. She recounted her experiences with the Bradfords, the threats she had endured, and her unwavering determination to find her daughter. Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she spoke of Clara and the bond they had forged. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Leonard's defense was crumbling. The evidence was too damning, the witnesses too credible. The tide was turning, and the Bradfords' iron grip on their legacy was slipping. But just when it seemed victory was within reach, an unexpected development threatened to derail everything. One of the key witnesses, a former employee of the Bradfords who had provided crucial testimony, suddenly recanted their statement. The defense seized on this opportunity, arguing that the entire case was built on unreliable evidence. Clara and Eleanor were devastated. The prosecution worked tirelessly to counter the blow, but the uncertainty cast a shadow over the trial. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Leonard was behind the witness's sudden change of heart, using his remaining influence to manipulate the proceedings. Despite the setback, they pressed on. Margaret continued to publish updates on the trial, rallying public support and keeping the pressure on the Bradfords. Robert worked tirelessly behind the scenes, uncovering additional evidence to bolster their case. One evening, as Clara and Eleanor reviewed the day's events, a knock at the door interrupted them. Robert stood on the porch, his expression urgent. "I found something," he said, holding up a folder. Inside were documents Leonard had tried to hide, proof of additional bribes and threats made to silence witnesses. The papers painted a damning picture of his desperation to cover up his crimes. "This could be the breakthrough we need," Robert said, his voice filled with hope. The new evidence was introduced in court, turning the tide once again. The prosecution presented it with precision, leaving no room for doubt about Leonard's guilt. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial neared its conclusion. When the verdict was finally announced, the tension in the room was palpable. Clara held Eleanor's hand tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Guilty," the judge declared, his voice ringing through the courtroom. A wave of emotion swept over Clara and Eleanor. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she hugged Eleanor tightly, the weight of the past finally lifting from her shoulders. It was a moment of justice, hard won and deeply felt. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements, but Clara and Eleanor slipped away quietly, seeking solace in each other's company. They returned home, where the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, and the weight of their journey settled into a bittersweet sense of relief. That night, Clara sat by the window, watching the snow fall once more. Eleanor joined her, a soft smile on her face. "We did it," Clara said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with pride and love. "We did." They sat in silence for a while, the bond between them stronger than ever. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she knew they would face it together. In the weeks following the trial, the town began to settle into a new rhythm. The Bradfords' influence had waned, their name now synonymous with scandal and corruption. Leonard faced a lengthy prison sentence, and several of his accomplices were under investigation. For the first time in decades, their hold over the community was broken, leaving space for healing and renewal. Clara found herself navigating the aftermath with mixed emotions. The victory in court had brought a sense of justice for her parents, but it also stirred a lingering sadness for all that had been lost. She threw herself into her work at the cafe, finding solace in the routine and the warmth of the people who had rallied around her during the trial. Eleanor, too, adjusted to the quieter days. She spent her mornings tending to her garden, her afternoons with Clara, and her evenings reading by the fire. The search for her daughter, which had consumed so many years of her life, was over. Clara had filled a void she hadn't realized was so deep, and though the pain of the past lingered, there was a new lightness in her heart. One snowy afternoon, Clara and Eleanor decided to visit the cemetery where Clara's parents were buried. It had been months since Clara had last come, and she felt it was time to share the news with them in her own way. The cemetery was quiet, the snow crunching underfoot as they walked between the rows of headstones. Clara knelt by her parents' grave, brushing away the snow that had gathered on the marker. She traced the engraved letters with her fingers, her breath visible in the cold air. "We did it," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We fought for you, and we won. I hope you're proud." Eleanor stood beside her, a comforting hand on her shoulder. "They would be," she said, her voice warm and certain. "Your parents raised a remarkable woman." Clara smiled through her tears, grateful for Eleanor's words. They stood together in silence, the bond between them stronger than ever. As they walked back to the car, Eleanor paused, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "Clara," she began, "I've been thinking about what's next for us." Clara tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" "There's so much good we could do," Eleanor said. her eyes bright with determination. "We've seen what happens when people abuse their power, but we've also seen how powerful it can be to stand up for what's right. I think we should find a way to help others who've been wronged, just like we were." Clara considered Eleanor's words, feeling a spark of excitement. The idea of channeling their experience into something meaningful resonated deeply. "That's a wonderful idea," she said. "But how do we start?" Eleanor smiled. "One step at a time, just like we did before. We'll figure it out together." Over the next few weeks, they began laying the groundwork for what would become a community foundation. Their goal was simple: to provide support for families in need, whether they were facing legal battles, financial hardship, or emotional struggles. They reached out to Margaret, who eagerly joined their efforts, using her platform to spread the word. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from people who had followed their story, inspired by their courage and resilience. Local businesses offered their support, and volunteers stepped forward to help. Clara and Eleanor were humbled by the outpouring of generosity and quickly got to work organizing their first initiatives. One of their earliest projects was creating a scholarship fund in honor of Clara's parents, ensuring that their legacy would continue to inspire others. Clara poured her heart into the effort, meeting with students and hearing their stories. It was a reminder of the goodness in the world, even amidst the pain. As the foundation grew, so did the bond between Clara and Eleanor. They worked side by side, their shared purpose bringing them closer than ever. For Eleanor, it was a chance to channel the love she had for her long-lost daughter into something tangible, and for Clara, it was a way to honor her parents' memory while building a brighter future. One evening, as they sorted through letters from people seeking the foundation's help, Clara came across an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph of her parents, taken years before she was born. There was no note, just the picture, but something about it felt significant. "Eleanor, look at this," Clara said, showing her the photo. Eleanor studied it closely, her brow furrowing. "I've never seen this before," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Where did it come from?" "I don't know," Clara admitted, turning the photo over to check for any clues. There was nothing but a faint watermark on the back, indicating it had been printed at a photo shop in a nearby town. Curiosity piqued, they decided to visit the shop the next day. The owner, an elderly man with a kind smile, remembered the photo immediately. "A woman brought it in a few weeks ago," he said. "She asked me to make a copy and mail it to this address." He handed them a slip of paper with the foundation's address written in neat handwriting. Clara's heart raced as she realized the photo might be a clue to something more. "Do you remember what she looked like?" Clara asked, her voice urgent. The man nodded. "She was about your age, with dark hair and kind eyes. Seemed nervous but polite. Said it was important you get the picture." Clara and Eleanor exchanged a glance, a mixture of hope and apprehension filling the air. Who was this woman, and why had she sent the photo? As they left the shop, the questions swirled in Clara's mind. The trial was over, and justice had been served, but it seemed their story wasn't finished yet. Clara couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had sent the photograph. Who was she, and what did she know about her parents? The picture itself was simple: her mother and father standing in front of a familiar house, smiling at the camera, yet something about it felt significant, as though it held a secret she couldn't yet see. Eleanor was equally intrigued. If this woman went through the trouble of finding a photograph of your parents and mailing it anonymously, there must be a reason, she said as they walked back to the car. Clara nodded, clutching the photo tightly. "But why didn't she just come to us directly?" "Maybe she's afraid," Eleanor suggested. "After everything we've uncovered, it wouldn't surprise me if she's worried about getting involved." The mystery weighed heavily on Clara's mind as the days passed. She kept the photograph on her nightstand, studying it every evening before bed, hoping some new detail would reveal itself. One night, she noticed something she hadn't seen before: a faint outline of another figure in the background, partially obscured by the shadows of the house. The discovery made her pulse quicken. Who was the person in the background, and why were they there? The next morning, she showed Eleanor, who examined the photo with a magnifying glass. "It's hard to tell," Eleanor said, her voice thoughtful. "But whoever it is, they're watching your parents. That much is clear." They decided to revisit the house where the photo had been taken. It was the home where Clara had lived as a young child, before her parents had moved to the smaller house where the accident had left her alone. The property had been sold after their deaths, and Clara hadn't been back since. The house looked different now. Its once vibrant exterior faded and overgrown with ivy. As they approached, an elderly man stepped onto the porch, squinting at them through thick glasses. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Clara hesitated before speaking. "I used to live here with my parents," she explained. "We were hoping to ask you about something." The man nodded slowly. "I remember hearing about what happened. Tragic, just tragic." He gestured for them to come closer. "What do you need to know?" Clara handed him the photograph, pointing to the shadowy figure in the background. "Do you recognize this house or this person?" The man studied the photo, his expression serious. "This is the old Miller place," he said, tapping the image of the house. "But as for the person, hard to say. Could be anyone." Disappointed but not deterred, Clara and Eleanor thanked him and left. As they walked back to the car, Clara felt a pang of frustration. The photograph seemed to raise more questions than it answered. That evening, they shared their findings with Robert, who had continued working with them even after the trial ended. He took the photograph and promised to enhance the image, hoping to get a clearer view of the figure in the background. A few days later, Robert returned with the enhanced image. The figure was still partially obscured, but the details were sharper. It was a woman, her posture tense, her face turned slightly away from the camera. "Do you recognize her?" Robert asked, sliding the image across the table. Clara stared at it, her heart racing. The woman looked vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place her. Eleanor, however, gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is it?" Clara asked, alarmed by her reaction. Eleanor hesitated before answering, her voice trembling. I think this might be one of the nurses who worked at the hospital where I gave birth to your mother." Clara's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Eleanor nodded, though her expression was conflicted. "It's been years, but I never forgot her face. She was kind to me, even when everyone else was cold. I always wondered if she knew more about what happened than she let on." The revelation added a new layer to the mystery. If the woman in the photograph was connected to Eleanor's past, it raised the possibility that she had played a role in the events that had shaped their lives. With Robert's help, they began searching for the woman, combing through old records and contacting former employees of the hospital. It was slow work, but their persistence paid off when they finally found a lead. The woman, whose name was Sylvia, was living in a small town a few hours away. Clara and Eleanor decided to visit her, their anticipation tempered by nerves. They arrived at a modest house surrounded by a neatly tended garden, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. Sylvia answered the door cautiously, her expression wary. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice guarded. Eleanor stepped forward, her tone gentle but firm. "Sylvia, my name is Eleanor Bradford. You may not remember me, but I believe you worked at the hospital where I gave birth to my daughter many years ago." Sylvia's eyes widened, her face paling. For a moment, she seemed ready to deny everything. But then she sighed heavily and stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. Inside, they sat in a small living room filled with framed photographs and crocheted blankets. Sylvia remained silent for a long time, her hands trembling as she folded them in her lap. "I never wanted to get involved," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Not after what they did to you." Eleanor leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What do you mean? What did they do?" Sylvia looked at her with tears in her eyes. "The Bradfords. They didn't just force you to give up your daughter. They took her and placed her with someone they could control. They wanted to make sure she never came back to you." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more devastating than she had imagined. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Sylvia shook her head, her face etched with guilt. "I was scared. They were powerful, and they made it clear what would happen if I talked. But I've carried this guilt for years, and when I saw the article about your trial, I knew I had to do something." Clara and Eleanor exchanged a look, their determination renewed. The mystery wasn't over, but they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Sylvia's confession left Clara and Eleanor stunned. The older woman's trembling words hung in the air like a delicate thread, waiting to be woven into the broader story of their lives. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself, and asked the question that burned in both their minds. "Do you know where my daughter was taken?" Sylvia hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I don't know exactly. I wasn't told the details, but I overheard enough to piece some of it together. They placed her with a family in another state, one that owed the Bradfords a favor. She was supposed to grow up far away from here, far away from you." She paused, her voice thick with regret. "I always wondered what happened to her. I hoped she was happy, but I never knew for sure." Clara felt a rush of emotion, anger at the injustice, sadness for her mother's stolen childhood, and a spark of hope that they might finally uncover the truth. "Is there anything else you can tell us? Anything at all that could help?" Sylvia reached for a small box on the shelf beside her. She opened it with trembling hands and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is all I have. It's a note I found after the Bradfords sent me away from the hospital. It doesn't have much, but maybe it'll give you something to go on." Eleanor took the paper, her fingers trembling as she unfolded it. The note was brief, scrawled in a hurried hand. "The child has been placed with the Harringtons in Boston. Do not contact or interfere." The name leapt off the page, a glimmer of direction in the fog of uncertainty. Eleanor stared at it, her heart pounding. "The Harringtons," she murmured. "It's something. It's a place to start." Sylvia nodded. "I'm so sorry for everything. I wish I could have done more back then." Eleanor reached across the table, taking Sylvia's hand in hers. "You've done more than enough. Thank you." Clara and Eleanor left Sylvia's house with a renewed sense of purpose. The name Harrington gave them a thread to pull, a path to follow in their search for answers. As they drove back, Clara could see the determination in Eleanor's eyes, a fire that hadn't dimmed despite all they had faced. The next morning, they began their search in earnest. Robert joined them, using his network to track down records and connections to the Harrington family. It didn't take long to find a lead, a prominent couple named James and Margaret Harrington who had lived in Boston during the time frame Sylvia had mentioned. They had adopted a daughter around the same time Eleanor's child had been taken. Clara and Eleanor pored over the information Robert provided, their anticipation growing with each new detail. The Harringtons had since passed away, but their daughter, a woman named Emily, was still alive. She lived in a small town in Vermont, far from the city where her childhood had begun. The decision to contact Emily was not an easy one. Eleanor worried about what she might find, whether Emily would want to meet her, or whether the years of separation had created a gap too wide to bridge. But Clara encouraged her, reminding her that they had come this far and couldn't stop now. With Robert's help, they wrote a letter to Emily, carefully explaining the situation and asking if she would be willing to meet. They included the photograph of Clara's parents, hoping it might spark recognition or connection. The wait for a response was agonizing. Days turned into weeks, and just as doubt began to creep in, a letter arrived. Clara opened it with shaking hands, reading aloud as Eleanor sat beside her. "Dear Eleanor and Clara, thank you for reaching out to me. I admit, your letter took me by surprise, and I've spent the past few days trying to process everything. The photograph you included stirred something in me, a feeling I can't quite explain. I would like to meet you, if only to understand more about my past and where I come from. Let me know when and where, and I will be there. Sincerely, Emily." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as Clara finished reading. "She wants to meet," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Clara hugged her tightly. "We're going to meet her, Eleanor. Your daughter." The days leading up to the meeting were a blur of nerves and anticipation. They arranged to meet Emily at a quiet cafe halfway between their towns, a neutral space where they could talk without distraction. As the day approached, Clara found herself thinking about her mother and how much this meeting would have meant to her. She carried her mother's journal with her, a symbol of the connection they were about to rediscover. When they arrived at the cafe, Emily was already there, sitting by the window with a cup of tea in front of her. She looked up as they entered, her expression a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Eleanor froze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. Then she stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Emily's. "Emily," she said softly. Emily stood, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Eleanor?" The two women stared at each other for a long moment before Eleanor moved closer, her arms opening hesitantly. Emily stepped into the embrace, and the years of separation seemed to dissolve as they held each other tightly. Clara watched, her heart swelling with emotion. She felt her mother's presence in that moment, as though she were standing beside her, smiling through tears. For the first time, she truly felt that they were a family that had endured unimaginable pain but had found its way back to one another. As they sat down to talk, the conversation flowed easily. Emily shared her memories of growing up with the Harringtons, her questions about her origins, and the sense of something missing that had always lingered in the back of her mind. Eleanor listened intently, her hand never straying far from Emily's. By the end of the day, it was clear that this was only the beginning of their journey together. They left the cafe with plans to meet again, their hearts lighter than they had been in years. For Clara, it was a reminder that even in the face of loss, love and connection could endure. The days after their meeting with Emily felt like a dream. Eleanor couldn't stop replaying the moments in her mind. The sound of Emily's voice, the way she laughed, the familiar tilt of her head that reminded Eleanor so much of her daughter. For years, she had carried the weight of loss, never imagining she would have the chance to reconnect with the family she thought was gone forever. Clara felt a quiet sense of peace as she watched Eleanor and Emily grow closer. The bond between them was immediate, as though time and distance had been unable to sever the invisible thread that connected their hearts. Clara was overjoyed to see Eleanor so happy, but she also couldn't ignore the bittersweet ache of her own loss. She wished her mother could be there to witness this reunion, to know that the family she had always longed for was finally coming together. Emily visited often, bringing small gifts and photographs from her life with the Harringtons. She spoke openly about her childhood, how she had always felt loved but couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She had asked questions about her birth parents over the years, but the Harringtons had only vague answers, and as she grew older, she stopped asking. "When I saw the photo of your parents," Emily said one evening, "it was like a missing piece clicked into place. I didn't recognize them, but I felt something, like they were connected to me in a way I couldn't explain." Eleanor reached out, taking Emily's hand. "They were your family," she said softly. "And now, you're part of ours again." It wasn't just words. Eleanor and Clara made every effort to include Emily in their lives, inviting her to dinners, introducing her to their friends, and sharing stories of the past. Emily, in turn, shared her own memories, filling in gaps and offering new perspectives that brought the family's story full circle. One afternoon, Emily arrived with a small, weathered box. She placed it on the table and opened it carefully, revealing a collection of letters, photographs, and keepsakes she had inherited from the Harringtons. "I think these might help us understand more," she said. "My parents always said they wanted me to know where I came from, even if they didn't have the answers themselves." The three of them sifted through the contents of the box, piecing together fragments of Emily's life and the choices that had shaped it. Among the papers, they found a letter addressed to Eleanor, written in a familiar hand. Eleanor unfolded it carefully, her heart racing as she read. "Eleanor, I wish I could have done more to protect her. We loved her as our own, but we knew she belonged to you. Please know that she was safe and loved, and that we never stopped believing you would find her someday. Margaret Harrington." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as she handed the letter to Clara and Emily. "They knew," she whispered. "They knew all along." Emily placed a comforting hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "They loved me," she said, "and now I know you would have too, if you'd been given the chance." Eleanor pulled Emily into a hug, her tears falling freely. "You were always loved," she said, "even when I couldn't be there. You were always in my heart." As the months passed, their family continued to grow closer. Eleanor and Emily found a rhythm in their relationship, balancing the newness of their connection with the depth of their shared history. Clara, too, found herself feeling more at peace. The questions that had haunted her for so long were finally being answered, and though the pain of losing her parents would never fully fade, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. The community foundation they had started thrived, drawing support from people inspired by their story. Clara took on a leadership role, working with Eleanor and Emily to expand their efforts and help even more families in need. The work brought her a sense of purpose, a way to honor her parents' memory and carry their legacy forward. On a crisp spring morning, they gathered at the foundation's headquarters for a special event, the dedication of a new scholarship fund in honor of Clara's parents. Friends, supporters, and members of the community filled the room, their faces glowing with pride and admiration. Eleanor stepped forward to speak, her voice steady but full of emotion. Today, we honor two remarkable people who showed us what it means to love, to give, and to fight for what's right. Clara's parents may no longer be with us, but their spirit lives on in everything we do. Clara joined Eleanor at the podium, her heart swelling with gratitude. This foundation wouldn't exist without the love and strength of my family. My parents, my grandmother, and now, my Aunt Emily. Together, we've turned pain into hope, and I'm so proud of what we've accomplished. The applause was thunderous, filling the room with warmth and energy. As Clara looked out at the faces of the people who had supported them, she felt a deep sense of connection to her community, to her family, and to the future they were building together. That evening, as the sun set over the town, Clara, Eleanor, and Emily gathered in Eleanor's garden. They sat around a small fire, sharing stories and laughter as the stars began to emerge. Tobias lay at their feet, his tail wagging contentedly. For the first time in years, Clara felt truly at peace. She knew the road that had brought them here had been long and difficult, but it had also been worth every step. They had found each other, against all odds, and they had turned their pain into something beautiful. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Eleanor looked at Clara and Emily, her eyes shining with love. "We've come so far," she said, "and I couldn't be prouder of the family we've become." Clara smiled, taking Eleanor's hand. "We've built something amazing," she said, "and we're just getting started." Together, they sat under the stars, their hearts full of hope for the future.